Hi, everyone. Welcome to Off the Rack, conversations on transformative leadership with yours truly, Walt Rakowich. As many of you know, in my former life, I was the Chief Executive Officer of Prologis, and since then, the author of Transfluence, a book about the opportunity that we all have to make a transformative influence in the lives of those that we lead and those around us. If you've been following my Off the Rack series, it's great to be reconnected with you. And if you're new, then I'm just happy to have you join us. On a monthly basis, I host conversations with some of the most thoughtful voices, guiding leaders to be more human and more influential in the workplace. If you're interested in checking out previous episodes, then there's a link below so that you can become more familiar with some of the guests that I've welcomed onto the show. Today, I'm honored to host two mental health experts who I admire greatly, Dr. Neill Epperson and Dr. Matt Mishkind. Neill is Department of Psychiatry professor and chair at the University of Colorado-Anschutz Medical Campus, and Matt is a deputy director at the University of Colorado-Anschutz Medical Campus Johnson Depression Center. As many of you know, this month is Mental Health Awareness Month, something that is near and dear to my heart and to my wife, Sue's heart. This month, I wanted to dedicate this episode of Off the Rack to bring awareness to the importance of normalizing mental health conversations in the workplace. Lord knows that we need to. Neill and Matt, I just want to welcome you to the show. Great to have you both on.
It's a pleasure to be here, Walt. It was such an honor to be asked. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Walt. I'm really excited and super excited to be here.
You great. You bet. It's a great topic, and we need to dig more into it. But before we dive into our conversation, can you both, sort of briefly give the audience some background on who you are and what you do?
Sure, absolutely. As you said, I'm chair of the Department of Psychiatry here at CU Anschutz. I've been here about 4.5 years. I'm an East Coaster. And so I spent most of my academic career on first at Yale and then at the University of Pennsylvania before taking on this role. And I just couldn't be more excited to be here in Colorado. It's a great department. And I know you speak to a lot of CEOs and leaders of business enterprises. And just to help people understand what a chair of a department is, they're like a CEO of a business. Our business happens to have 700 employees. So, and our products are outstanding clinical care, creating new knowledge, and training the next generation. So building the workforce. And here in Colorado at CU, our North Star is to improve the mental health landscape for all Coloradans.
Matt?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm a couple of roles here. I'm the deputy director of the Depression Center, Johnson Depression Center, and I'm also the director of the community engagement services here in the department. My background's a little different. My PhD is actually in organizational psychology, so I've worked in businesses a lot. So this is actually something I've thought a lot about and had a lot of connections with mental health and in organizations and business. I've worked in a military setting before as well, did some work in the government for about 10 years, but everything I've done, maybe not everything, but a lot of what I've done has really touched on mental health. And I've worked in clinical settings for quite some time and have been doing this work for 20 plus years. I think for me too, one thing I always like to throw out there is I'm a dad, right? So all those things, I got 3 kids. So I'm in that place where a lot of the mental health issues just in society, we're dealing with a lot of those outside of the professional setting as well. So I think that brings a different perspective on things too.
Definitely. I'm so glad that the two of you are both here today. I think it'll be great to get both of your perspectives on some of the topics. So thanks again for joining. Look, wellness is a popular topic these days. And it's getting more and more popular within the business community for sure. And as we've discussed, that the three of us have discussed prior, many people don't include mental health in wellness discussions. Often they use, and I see it a lot in business, they use the term wellness. instead of mental health. And so I think there's some confusion out in the marketplace. And so, can you both, and one or the other, maybe Neill, you can maybe kick it off, but can you both just kind of explain your views on the differences between the two?
Sure. And I think it's really a timely topic because you're right. People want to talk about wellness in a way that, truthfully, I worry a little bit that it's a euphemism, like you said, for mental health, because people are uncomfortable talking about mental health. But truthfully, I think mental health is a euphemism for talking about mental illness. It used to be that when we didn't know maybe about all the causes of cancer or have some of the curative treatments that we have, people used to whisper cancer. And I find that now people still, even when they should be talking about mental illness and what to do to prevent it, what to do to identify it, they want to shift into only a focus on wellness. And so I think we have to be really honest with ourselves about what we mean by wellness. I mean, obviously, we have a wellness officer in our department. We spend a lot of time thinking about wellness because the work we do is really hard. We spend a lot of time listening to people who are in intense emotional pain. And we need to be thinking about the wellness of the people who work in this department. And so, but when we think about that, we're thinking about systemic issues that could really decrease job satisfaction, systemic issues that could impact whether they have burnout and symptoms of burnout. But burnout is not in itself a mental illness. It can lead someone who's at risk for depression or anxiety problems, or if somebody is also dealing with anxiety and depression, it can impact their job satisfaction as well as performance. So when we think about wellness, I would say focusing on things like job satisfaction, systemic issues that leaders can address, and also things that really sort of decrease somebody's ability to do their work. When we talk about mental illness discussions in various industries or in companies or enterprises, I really think we need to just say what it is. It's mental illness. It's not mental health. It's mental illness that we're trying to treat. Just like you don't go to a cancer center to get a drug that is not, that is treating cancer, lack of cancer. You're actually going to get treatment for the cancer, and it is a cancer center. And so we can say that now because people feel much more comfortable with issues around cancer care, but we are still struggling when it comes to mental illness.
Matt, I'll let you respond to that too. I know you work with various companies out there. I'd kind of like to get your take on the two.
Yeah, I'd say I agree, definitely about the euphemism. And I have to admit, I fall into it as well. I think sometimes it's maybe even the easier term. It's sort of like mental health, and it gets people talking. It sort of like moves you through it. But I do think a lot of times when we're talking about it, we are talking about mental illness. And when you look at mental health, it is quite broad. It's quite encompassing. I know you talked a lot in your book about meaning through purpose. To me, that's mental health. I mean, I think that's something we're talking about that's been shown to reduce burnout. It reduces stress. To me, that's an aspect of mental health. Maybe we call it wellness. Maybe it's prevention. Maybe it's on the preventative side of mental health. And I think that's a lot of what in businesses, in organizations, where we're seeing people is on that prevention side. So how do we keep it from mental illness? I think we need to talk more about mental illness because really that's what we're trying to help alleviate, help prevent, or help lessen the chronicity. But I don't think we talk about it enough. We talk more about mental health. And I've seen a lot of leaders, a couple of examples, and one here locally, one that's done a really good job of really raising the awareness and really focusing on suicide is RK. So they're a construction company. They do maintenance, they do service. They have actually brought in a lot of suicide prevention training and initiatives to really talk about this is what it is. We're talking about suicide. We're going to approach this topic much like we need to talk about mental illness, much like the reason we're named the Depression Center. We wanted to name it. And so they've really focused on suicide prevention and have done a lot of trainings, very open conversations. That's been a huge game changer and has really changed the culture of the company. And I think part of that was not talking about wellness, not talking just generally about mental health, but really saying we have, construction industry is 1 or 2, depending on how you look at the data, in terms of rates for suicide. And they said, we're going to address this. We are going to address specifically suicide. And they've done a lot of initiatives and have really changed the culture in a high rate industry.
Matt, did they do that with all of their employees?
They have opened it up. I don't know if all of their employees, the way you probably know a lot better than I do, the way construction is, you have people out on the job sites and things like that, but yeah. They have, I know recently we've done some of their trainings recently in this last round of just a few trainings, they had 125 people voluntarily come through it. So some of this is also a voluntary basis. Like I said, I don't know if every single person, but I think they've really tried to broaden it. Yeah, and the top folks in the company too, because I think it also goes, it goes down. Yeah,
I mean, I have to admit, when I was running Prologis, it was not tops on our radar. It just wasn't. Just the whole issue of mental illness wasn't. So I think increasingly it's becoming more and more. And to take something that said, where you say this is what's happening in my industry, and then say, okay, what can we do to address that which is prevalent in our industry, I think is really ahead of the game. But something that we all need to be focused on. Yeah. So I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. I think being open about mental illness in the workplace starts with leadership. It kind of starts, it's like anything, it starts from the top, and then it sort of trickles throughout the company. And the culture needs to, the culture really needs to reflect, the way the leaders think. And in my book, Transfluence, I shared that one of my biggest challenges during my time at Prologis was coming to the realization that I first needed to break down my own walls as a leader before anybody around me could do the same thing. And I had to put myself in some cases in a vulnerable position, which I think then allowed me to collaborate throughout the company. I write about that in my book. Could you guys speak a little bit to that? I don't know if you have an example, but just speak to it, or perhaps share an example if you have one of, why it's important for leaders to, if you will, break down their walls and be open in their organization and talking about mental health.
Right. Well, I think you have to be brave, one. So because it isn't something naturally that we do in industry or any kind of organization. The leader feels like, okay, I have to be so strong, and I have to demonstrate that I've got everything under control, because I'm going to make other people anxious, or I'm going to make people think I'm not going to be good at my job. Yeah. And, we just know that that's not true. I mean, we know that people who basically admit, okay, I've had depression, or I've used psychotherapy, or I have a family member with bipolar disorder, or whatever it might be that they've had a personal lived experience with, I have seen it only be a benefit. And particularly here on campus, I saw it happen with a lot of the other chairs of departments, that, everybody was struggling. Everybody was incredibly stressed. And when the leaders took it upon themselves to say, hey, I needed to seek some treatment, it's been really helpful for me, or I know that this is how you can get into treatment, that made a huge difference. And I can tell you, they all still have their jobs. They're all still incredibly well respected. They didn't lose anything. They actually gained something that I think other people are just hungry for. They want to see their leaders being real people and understanding what they struggle with.
Yeah. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I see vulnerability. It's hard. It shows you're a human being, right? It shows that you have things in you that I think we don't want other people to see, or we want people to think like we've never made mistakes, right? And so I think it's really hard. I think it's a huge strength to be able to show vulnerability. And from a work setting, I like to tie vulnerability into self-awareness and empathy. You need self-awareness to really even know what you need to be vulnerable about. And by you being vulnerable, it allows you to look inside yourself and actually understand other people. And that's that empathy part. And there is research that shows that employees who work for more empathic leaders are actually more engaged, they're more innovative, they're more likely to stay around, and they have better balance in their lives. And employees actually respond to that, not in a sneering way. They actually respond positively to it. They feel like they're better understood, they have better connections. And that actually has, I think it's a competitive advantage if you have leaders and managers who are empathic.
Yeah. The question is, how do you teach people to do that?
Well,
easier said than done, right?
There are trainings. There are trainings, and you can learn to do it. And I honestly think a lot of it has to do with that, with the idea of self-awareness and
yeah.
really feeling like you're allowed to be, or feeling comfortable to actually look inside yourself and think about it. So it is you can teach the skill. I think some people come by it naturally. Some people have to think a little bit more about it as it's happening, but you can teach it. It's a teachable skill.
Yeah, and I think there's power in coaching. Not that we're going to go down that path today, but I do think that there's power in somebody else assessing you and allowing you to understand where your weaknesses and your strengths are and the like, and having you work on them. Mm-hmm. But I want to talk a little bit more, stay on this topic a little bit, but talk about the importance of leaders having the power to take the first step, providing their employees with healthcare resources and all those sorts of things. Most companies have an employee assistance program in place. But, you guys have mentioned to me in the past that this is an issue, at least in our past conversations, that many companies aren't really all that familiar, or employees don't really know how to access it internally, or don't know what it provides, their employee assistance programs. And so can you share a little bit with the audience, just ways that organizations can improve their systems, their benefits, and also ensure that they're easily accessible in today's marketplace?
Yeah, I'd like to take that first, if you don't mind, because I'm not knocking EAPs. They certainly are really important programs for a lot of organizations. But you talk about the employees not knowing what's available to them. Quite frankly, the leaders really need to know what happens when somebody calls an EAP. They make it very clear how to reach them, but they also need to know, do they run into roadblocks of getting into their EAP? How many sessions can they possibly get? And I think that we have to be very careful to say that not all therapists or people who work in any setting have all the skills that your employees may need. So, for example, there's people who are at risk for suicide in particular, but chronic persistent sort of mental health issues like recurrent depression or what have you. One of the biggest risk factors for that is childhood adversity and neglect, or being raised in a adverse environment in some way, shape, or form. Maybe you witnessed domestic violence. Maybe your father or mother were abusing substances and really weren't there for you. And we know that increases risk for how you respond to future stressors. So if you don't have somebody who really understands, trauma-informed care and knows how to provide evidence-based trauma-informed care, you're going to really be missing out on what a lot of people need. So knowing whether EAP covers 8 to 12 visits, are the people trained in these evidence-based psychotherapies? If somebody really needs a psychotropic medication like an antidepressant or a mood stabilizer, can they get that through their EAP? I would guess that most leaders don't know the answers to these questions. And how can you lead and let people know about what they have available to them if you don't know yourself? Mm-hmm. So, I would say, and especially, I'm a women's health expert. And so my research for years has been on the role of gonadal steroids and how they affect women and their behavior and their brain functioning. And we have a lot of women in the workforce, and they have different stressors. they're more likely to have experienced higher levels of childhood adversity. And so if you're a leader and you predominantly have female employees, you really want to make sure that the services that you can provide to them are sensitive to what a woman might need versus what a man might need. Men are more likely to have impulse control problems, substance use problems. And so you may want an EAP that's very heavily focused on substance use disorders. Whereas if you're more predominantly a female-led organization and most of your employees are females, you really want somebody who understands anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Well, I wouldn't have thought of that. Matt, do you want to add to that?
Well, I want to completely echo what Neill says about checking the EAP. I think that's a big gap where, you know, if you call the EAP, try to track it through and see where you actually get to. And if you get referred out, you know, we hear stories about people getting referred out to a provider, and the provider says, I don't know why I'm still listed on, I haven't taken that insurance in years, right? And they run into kind of those dead ends. We actually, I was talking to somebody who was also actually in the construction industry, a different company, and he said he had taken it on himself to start calling his EAP, and he was just blown away by the barriers and some of the things that were happening and how hard it was for him to get into it. And he said he took that upon himself as a leader to really focus on making some changes to their EAP. You know, I think before that, and maybe more of a strategic perspective, is to start to think about, what do we want from our EAP? What are we looking for? Is it financial assistance? Is it healthcare? Is it just mental health? You know, what are we really trying to do with our EAP to make sure it's really focused? One of the things which I was reading about recently was making sure you don't have duplicative services. And people get these kind of services somewhere else too, and therefore they're not using the EAP, or they're using the EAP when it'd be better for them to use something else. So look at that. I think what Neill said was right on with professional standards, credentials, making sure that the people that are being hired are actually to the level that you need them to be. And then, you know, thinking about ways that you want to evaluate it. Just having it is great, but how are you actually evaluating it? Are you looking at the number of calls? Are you looking at the return on investment of it? Are you looking at the referrals that go out? So I think those are some of the more strategic things that people can do with EAPs. And I would say, I mean, and this is, I guess, a promotion for folks like us, you know, talk to folks like us. I think one of the things that's interesting when you go into an EAP is you may get a few free sessions. You know, most evidence-based practices in psychology start at 12 to 15 sessions. So you have to think about, okay, what's happening in those 3 sessions? Then really, where is somebody going? Are they actually getting that referral out? Or does the EAP need to take on longer term sessions? So, you know, I think even understanding what is the evidence behind mental health treatment and talking to other experts about it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it's not just important for a leader to create a safe environment, which I think is critically important, but also to be informed. I mean, I have to admit, I never really read REAP, you know, when I was running the company, and looking back on it, I should have. And my guess is, Neill, that you're right. 99.9% of people haven't read it unless they've had an issue. But they haven't read it in preparation for someone else having an issue. So I think that's really great. Just a quick question. Obviously, Matt, you're Johnson Depression Center. So just to plug that for anybody that wants to, you know, improve on their EAP. But are there consultants that are out there that do that too, that specialize in that?
You know, there is actually, and I can't remember what it's called. There's an association for EAPs.
Okay.
And so my guess is there are consultants. I don't know that field as well in terms of the consultants, but I know there is an association. I know there are places to find out best practices and probably talk to people about kind of what's going on with EAPs. You know, I like sometimes though, in these kind of situations, if you can, is to find your own person too, who's objective. And, you know, there's no, somebody that you can kind of bounce some ideas off of, who's maybe not getting paid for it, doesn't really have any skin in the game, who can really give you an honest assessment. I think a lot of times those kind of connections are really, really helpful. I think they're really helpful, just, if you have somebody that you can talk to like that.
Yeah.
I'd like to also butt in here and propose something more radical than just focusing on your EAP and trying to get a better sense of it. But just as an example, during the pandemic, again, we're a campus of thousands of people, and we were finding that our employees on this campus, whether they were in the School of Medicine, working in our hospital settings, or even School of Pharmacy, what have you, that they were having real struggles where they wanted to get into some kind of mental health care, whether it was therapy or, I had people call us that said, what's going on right now is really triggered by post-traumatic stress disorder, and I am really suffering, so I know I need to see a psychiatrist. And we went to Chancellor Elliman, Don Elliman, who's chancellor of this campus, and said, we have student and resident mental health. I think we need faculty and staff mental health. And basically, we're providing that service here. People can choose to go outside or they can choose to use their EAP, but they also know that they're going to get quality evidence-based treatment if they're willing to come to our faculty and staff program. And some companies have, I know, agreed, said, okay, we want to hire people to do this work with us. Whether that person is somebody who just triages and makes sure that people get to the right place, or they provide the care themselves. I can tell you that each time you refer somebody down the line to somebody else, so like if you only get 2 sessions at EAP and then they're trying to refer you to somebody in the community for longer term care, the drop off is a leaky pipeline, let's just say, and your employee is highly unlikely to make it to that next stage if there's all of these different referrals. So having more control over it yourself is something that I would really challenge people to think about.
That's a great point. Great point. I want to move to something Matt, you mentioned return on investment. You were talking about, and you all in preparation for this, you both sent me something from the CDC that says that depression is estimated to cause 200 million lost work days annually. And the cost of this is somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 to $40 billion for employers, excuse me. And so first thing comes to my mind, I'm on 3 boards of directors. So, first thing, how can leaders talk to people internally about the importance of this issue, both to their boards as well as their employees? I mean, we're talking mostly about how do we create the right system, but how do we talk to our employees about it? How do we talk to our board about it? Are those messages even different than one from the other?
Well, I think Matt and I are pretty much on the same page about that. So Matt, you want to start?
Sure. I think the message is the same. I think the tone of the message and the contextualization of the message is different. I mean, I think we're naive to think that people who are in the workplace are looking around and not noticing that somebody's not there, or not noticing, presenteeism is a big word now, not noticing that somebody is there and they're not engaged. So I don't think it's a shock to anybody if you were to throw these numbers out. They're huge numbers, and so maybe they'd be that how big they are might be a shock. But I think nobody's really looking around not noticing these things. So I think to some extent, it's a tone issue. You don't want employees to feel like you're making this only for a return on investment decision, but you're doing it to make the workplace healthier, to make them healthier. As a business, I think we can look to smoking cessation, reductions in heart issues that really were taken on by businesses. A lot of public health campaigns through businesses. There were return on investment reasons for those, but there were also really caring about your employees and caring about them as people. I think that's the tone for employees. I think for boards, certainly boards want to take care of people as well, but they're also looking at a little bit more maybe of the nuts and bolts of the return on investment, and it's good business decision. I think that's probably what gets lost is people look at things like, oh, we can't possibly give 1 or 2 hours to mental health training or mental illness training. We can't possibly give somebody a couple hours more off, something like that. The return on that is actually huge. There's other data that shows for every dollar spent on prevention activities, you get $2 to $3 in return. So I think from a board's perspective, these efforts actually do pay dividends, and they are probably looking at it from that perspective a bit more than the employees who want to feel like they're taken care of. They have options, and they want to work for a place that cares about them.
No, I agree with what Matt is saying that, look, we've all seen how difficult it is to keep people working now. And also, bringing people back to work after the pandemic, and everybody kind of wants to work a different way. A lot of people want to work completely remotely, but we know as mental health care professionals and as a psychiatrist who studies human behavior, we know that it's really important to bring people together. We're a species that does better, and some of this is actually hormonal. We do better when we're together and we can support each other. But being together in an unsupportive environment is certainly not helpful to anybody. And that does lead to people having, decreased job satisfaction and burnout. So when you start thinking about what, if you're a leader, if you want to think about your wellness activities, those can be around things like, again, bringing people back, giving people opportunity to be together and to sort of work together again and get that kind of direct feedback. But if they're really wanting to focus on the mental illnesses that can occur, and it's not that they can occur, let's face it, they do occur. I mean, 1 out of 20 people are going to have, some kind of a mental health condition, and it's at any given time. And so if you're employing thousands of people, people in your enterprise are suffering from mental illness. So you can't really bury your head in the sand on that and say, okay, well, I'm not going to manage this piece, because it's just as important as getting people out walking at lunchtime or moving so that you give them an extra $20 a month because they clocked a certain number of steps. Again, you got to think about that from the perspective of people also suffering from depression and anxiety, PTSD, and bipolar disorder. So, that's how I look at those two together, the wellness and the focus on mental illness.
Yeah, I'm on the board of a company that during COVID, they had, I think, 3 suicide attempts in roughly a 2-week period of time.
Yes.
And that's enough to shake your core.
It is.
And unfortunately, I think that's becoming more common as time goes on.
Yeah.
So I think it's, something that you said, I think it's kind of common for employees to notice. Matt, I think you said that, it's not as if people don't notice. I think it's common for employees to notice their colleagues' well-being. And sometimes I think colleagues are even the first to notice lapses in personal well-being and mental health for those that they work with. And but I do think that sometimes people don't know how to engage with that. Like, what do I say? How do I do it? So from your experience, can you share what that might look like? How does an employee engage with someone who's showing signs or symptoms? And quite frankly, then to the next step, how does a leader, anybody, engage with somebody that they see that this happening within their organization?
I'll start it by telling you what it doesn't look like. And I'll give you an example. So I was talking to somebody recently, and he had an employee that was decompensating, and he had been doing it for a while, and they finally had to get him hospitalized. And so the leader went around and talked to everybody on the team. And what he found was that every single person on the team had noticed this going on. And it hadn't been going on for a day or two, it had been going on for months. But nobody said anything. Nobody ask the employee, hey, how are you doing? Nobody kind of talked to each other. Nobody talked to the leadership. And in talking to this leader, he said, I take that very personally as a culture issue that is on me to change, because I can't believe that people didn't, this is somebody that they all work with very closely, and nobody felt like they could either talk to him directly or bring it up to us. To me, that's a huge culture issue. So, we talk about, there's this concept called gatekeeper, and that's usually people, colleagues, others who are noticing things, who are able to talk to others. It's, I'm not going to say it's the most comfortable kind of conversation to ever have with somebody, but what we say is, have direct conversations, right? Talk to somebody directly. You don't personalize it. You focus on sort of the things that you're noticing. Maybe there's changes, maybe there's concerns that you have about how somebody, appears, and you're just concerned about them. So I think it's engaging at that level. You want to make sure you have time to have the conversation. We hear a lot about people say, hey, how you doing? And like, do you really want to know? Or is that just kind of this greeting? And so I think having direct, empathic, caring conversations are really important. We're doing some work right now with some students, and we're talking to them about what do you want? We're looking at some suicide prevention work. And so what do you want? And a lot of them so far have said, I want to talk. I may not bring it up on my own, but I want to talk. If somebody would just approach me, I would actually be willing to talk. I'm probably not going to do it on my own, but if another student, if a friend really just reached out and talked to me, I think I would talk. I think I would open up. And that to me is really important, that most people, I'll say most, but a lot of people are walking around with something they would love to talk about, something that's going on. Maybe it's huge. And they just are looking for somebody to kind of open up that conversation and really just kind of lead that conversation. And much like, you had mentioned coaching before, coaching is not intended to be always these long drawn out, interventions. They can be 5, 10, 15 minutes at a time. And I think that's where these conversations can be too. They don't have to be long. They're touch bases. They're opening up. They're letting somebody else know, hey, I noticed something. I care about you. I'm listening to you. I want to see if there's anything I can do. And I think from a leader's perspective, it's setting that culture that open conversations like that not only are okay, but they're encouraged. And if you're truly concerned about somebody and you reach out to them, that's not going to lead to an HR issue. You're going to be supported in the way that you had those conversations. So I think it's really direct conversations, noticing things, and just being willing to make that engagement. That's hard, but I think what we find is once we're willing to make that engagement, it's actually really rewarding, and people do open up.
Yeah.
And you also, Matt, have some training programs that we've done here in the Denver metro area through the Johnson Depression Center that really does come into, like Matt said, 120 employees might show up voluntarily, mainly because it's now part of the culture. And the people that we know that have been successful have really embraced this at the highest leadership. They're the owners of the business. And then they bring it to the managers, and then the managers are all trained. And so people get trained. And how do you have that critical conversation? Because Matt's right. It's not something, hey, you just don't seem well, or is everything okay? And what do I do if they say, yeah, I have been thinking about killing myself. I'm terribly depressed. I just don't know if I can go on. You might hear like that. They may not say that they are actually having, I'm going to kill myself. They might actually say to you, I'm just not sure I can go on. And then how do you get them to then say the next thing? Because what do they mean by that? It does take some training, but people get comfortable with it the more they do it. And there are definitely people we've worked with who have saved lives within their employee group because they've been able to have these conversations.
Yeah. It's interesting. Just 4 days ago, I was picked up at the Phoenix International Airport en route to Sedona. And a half an hour into the drive, the driver pulled over, and it was pitch black. And the driver pulled over and told me that he was having, he thought a heart attack, but ended up being an anxiety attack. And I had to wait on the side of the road with him. The ambulance came, and all that good stuff. And anyway, I ended up talking with his employer for the longest time, who was the dispatcher. And he had told me that he was overworked. He had been working since 4 a.m. It was 11 o'clock in the evening, and the dispatcher didn't even know it. The dispatcher said I had no idea he was working that hard. And it's just amazing how people that are on the front line, whether that be colleagues or whether that be, in my case, the customer, are oftentimes the ones that see it first. But when you do, you got to raise your hand, and it's the hardest thing to do, isn't it? But on the other hand, it's the best thing to do.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, and it often is going to be somebody that's not, a mental health professional who's going to see it,
Right.
who's going to see it first. And I think in the trainings that Neill had mentioned, we talk a lot about we as fellow employees, as neighbors, as friends, as people riding in a car, we can have a ton of impact on other people simply by listening, talking, opening up the conversation, and doing what we can in the moment to help. CPR, you're not then performing, open heart surgery for somebody. You're helping them on the spot. You're helping them get through something. That's a lot of what we can do as fellow employees or just as fellow human beings. There's a lot we can do.
Yeah, no question about it, Matt. So I ask all of my guests this last question. And so while, many of the challenges we talk about are difficult to solve today, I do think that just gratitude sometimes makes us better people. And it's not easy for everybody, and I get that. People have challenges in their life, but I think when we are thankful for something, it humbles us because we honor other people and we give credit to them as opposed to being focused too much on ourselves. That's just my point of view. And so Neill and Matt, I have to ask you both. And maybe one of these days I'll write a book about all the guests I've had and what they've said. But anyway, what are you most grateful for?
Do you want to go, Neill, or you want me to? I tried to narrow this down. I came up with 3 things. I'll go through them quickly.
Okay.
So one, certainly my family. And I think any day that's even a rough day, I'm grateful that I have them and I have their support and that they're there and we're a family. So certainly that's one thing. 2, I'm really grateful for people who have continued to give me a chance, who have looked over some of the things that maybe I didn't do as well as I should have, and kind of kept investing and engaging with me. So I'm really grateful for that. And 3, I am incredibly grateful for opportunities like this. It's not lost on me that having a PhD, going through, my work experience, gaining things, that's a privilege. And for me, it's really important for me to be able to now give back. That's one of the things I love about the job I'm in, is our ability to take what we know and give it out to other people. And I'm incredibly grateful to be able to do that.
That's wonderful, Matt. Neill, you're on the hot seat.
Along those lines, I have to reflect on sort of not only my current family, but my family of origin. I was raised by people who we came from a humble environment, so to speak, financially. But my parents always believed that I could do what I wanted to do in this world. And I knew I wanted to have an impact in an area that I was passionate about. And I didn't know that improving mental health was going to be, or understanding the causes of mental illness and its treatments were going to be my passion at the time. But, really knowing that I had that support and their belief in me. My current family has been my rock because, this job is big, it's tough, it's hard. And there's a lot going on, and we're in a crisis, and every day there's so much that we need to do that we just can't possibly do it all. And so having a family that really supports me and being able to have this role here at the University of Colorado and at the Johnson Depression Center to really make an impact and to do whatever I can to support people who are really suffering from mental illness. And that includes substance use disorders. And I know our culture sometimes separates those, but those are all brain illnesses and they're often intermingled. And so we need to be thinking about both of those. And so I just think it's a real privilege. And lastly, I want to say I am so grateful to you, Walt, and to your lovely wife, Sue. I mean, the two of you together represent to me people who really do put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, and get out and you use your mouthpiece to be able to get this information out more broadly and also support programs that are going to promote mental health by addressing mental illness. So I want to thank you for that as well.
Well, first of all, I want to thank both of you. I'm grateful that the both of you could be joining me on this episode. So thank you so much. It's been great to have you on, and I think the audience probably has learned a lot. I've learned a lot today too. And I'd like to just thank everybody that made the decision to be on today. Again, hopefully there's been a few tidbits of information that you can take away with you. And also, I'd like to just encourage everybody to keep an eye for future Off the Rack interviews. We do them monthly. And please check out my LinkedIn newsletter, which is now called Off the Rack Plus, where you can find episodes, you can find resources, you can find transcripts, you can find all kinds of stuff from many of the guests that we've had on. And so until then, I'd just like to encourage all of you to be human and to find a way to have a positive influence on somebody each and every day. And I'd like to thank you all for being on. See you next month.